Okay, so I have been for a run and I feel like building some queries. So, for those who are following this series, last episode we did a bit of work around getting our dependency injection up and running. So, where we left off was we had an application class, which is this one here. We had our application class routing to our controller, our solitary controller for the moment. So if I open source controller, here is our controller. So our application class takes the request in, routes to our controller. Our controller then calls our template manager, and our template manager at this point will render our template. I've changed, since that episode, I've actually made a few sort of minor changes here and there, but for the most part, the structure from a dependency injection standpoint is where it was. One thing I have changed is in my in my index.html file, I've now added this extends file layout.html. That's a mechanism that is included with Smarty, and it allows me to specify an overall layout and then have each page use that layout. So we can do things like keep a header consistent, keep a footer consistent, etc. If you were to look at this layout, which is in templates layout.html, what you'll see here is the HTML5 boilerplate application. Now, I've got a lot of erroneous stuff in here, things for Google Analytics and whatnot, which will populate later. But for now, all that we're really worried about is this main block, which when we go to each page, will have our page content rendered in here. This is our kind of header area, and this gets rendered on every page. So if I go to my running server, it looks like this. Now it's pretty sparse, and I haven't really spent any time bothering with styles because I don't want to get bogged down in that just yet. But you can get an idea of what we're trying to create here. So we've got the collab application, we've got a greeting message, which for the moment is hard-coded, and then we've got this big text box here that eventually what we want to be able to do is to track the currently logged in user, have that user type in a message, and then have this message post to the board. So if you picture kind of like a Slack type of situation where there's an organization of users and they can all post to their own organizations, and a user can be part of many organizations, etc., etc. So that's where we're up to now. If you want information on dependency injection and how I'm handling dependency injection, I'll put one of those card thingies up there, and that hit that link, and then it'll take you to the previous video, which I kind of explain dependency injection, and you can see a little bit more of how I set up the base application. Today, what I want to do is I want to get SQL up and running, specifically MySQL. And so to do that, I've got a couple of things. I've firstly got my Docker image. Let me click on this. Firstly, I've got my Docker image with MySQL running. We're going to cover Docker in a lot more detail in a later episode coming very soon. Just know for now that really all I've done is brought up a local Docker MySQL container, and that's running on port 3306, which I believe is the default. on the left-hand side here is my PHP server, which I've been using in previous videos. The other thing I've gone and done is I've downloaded MySQL Workbench, which is really, really cool and has a lot of very, very helpful tools to get you started. And I've put together a very basic schema at this point. So if I open up the schema, if I go back here, and then I go to this section, which is schemas, and then I click on default, this is the schema that I've gone ahead and designed. So it's a basic posts users. You've probably seen this before. If you haven't seen this before, you're definitely in the right place. So we have a user table with an email address, a first name, a last name, a created at, an updated at, etc. And we have a posts table, which is really simple. We've just got one, like a body text and then some timestamps, which I'm hoping to get updated. And then here I've got the foreign key user ID, which links these two tables together. And I've got my constraints all set up like that. Now, one thing I'm kind of interested in seeing that I've never actually done with MySQL before is if you look at the columns here in my ID, I'm actually using this default expression UUID. The reason I'm doing that is because I don't use like integer-based IDs that have been auto-incremented. The reason I don't do that is because if ever down the track you want to add multiple database servers to your cluster, single IDs like that, auto-incremented IDs won't work, because if you've got, say, two different database servers writing to a table at once and they're both auto-increment, you're going to get collisions. What you're better off doing is generating a UUID and making that as your primary key. The cost of doing that up front is fairly minimal. The cost of migrating from an existing database with auto-increment IDs to UUIDs is a little greater. So as a rule of thumb, whenever I'm starting out, I set up UUIDs like this. So I've never done this in MySQL before, so I'm not sure if I've got this exactly right, but we shall see. So there's my schema. If I go into here, this is like the active connection to my database that I've got set up with the Docker container that I showed you before, and based on this EER diagram that I created over here, the MySQL Workbench has gone ahead and created an export file for me, which is really cool. So it's going to set up all of this MySQL that I can't remember the syntax of, which is good. And then I've run this against my database. So here's my collab database. Here's my tables section, and we've got posts and users here. So that's that. Now, from here, what I would like to do is use PHP data objects to connect to that database that I just showed you. So the reason I've chosen PHP data objects is there's like this is kind of like the OO way of doing it, I guess. There's a functional way of connecting directly to MySQL, which is kind of what I was using way back in the day when I got started. But it seems like this does everything that we need it to, and because it's class-based, it will allow us to, it will play with our dependency injection strategy a lot better. Well, at least that's the hope. So we're going to set this all up now, and we're going to see how we go. And the place we're going to start is with this PDO object. All right, so let's set up our posts service. So I'm going to create a new file called posts service.php, and in here I'm going to set up my PHP tag, and I'm going to say class posts service, and here we're going to have one method that will save the post. So excuse me. So public function save, and we want to accept here a post body. Let's define a type, string post body. And we also want a string user ID. So this will be the UUID of the user. The other thing that we'll need is a construct function, and then this should accept my PDO object, which I believe is typed as so, and we're just going to call that DB for now. So we'll use our standard dependency injection initialization pattern where we set this DB to this DB to DB, and then we say private PDO DB, like that. Okay, so given that, actually before we move on, we also want to set up our collab namespace. Let's add this to our dependency context. So currently we have that in public index PHP, still got that annoying Vim error. And here we're going to say use collab posts service, like that. And then we're going to create posts service. We're going to create that new posts service like this, and then we're going to pass in our DB object. So what we want to do here at this point is configure our DB object. Now, some more astute people might notice that we're in public/index PHP and we're about to instantiate our DB object. That is generally going to be very bad practice. I wouldn't say necessarily very bad practice, but it's bad practice, because what we're actually doing is we're exposing our MySQL details within a public file that, say someone works out some exploit with our web server, or say we don't even configure our web server, what they'd be able to do is they'd be able to download the source, our PHP source code, and potentially see our database credentials. We'll fix this up later, but for now, we're just going to get up and running as quickly as possible. So if I go to the PDO construct, and then we go down here, they're showing us how to construct our PDO object here. So because we're really awesome developers, we're going to copy and paste code directly into our program. The DB name is collab. MySQL is what we want to use. And again, because we're really awesome developers, we're putting in root and secret, which is the password that I've got. Now, once again, don't use the root account for your SQL in production. It's fine to use it in your local environment, but in production, be aware that you should probably be creating specified accounts when you're accessing your database. Don't just use the default root account. But for now, because we want to get up and running really quickly, we don't care. All right, so we've got this try catch block, which we'll get next, and then this is going to fail our application, and it won't let us proceed, which is exactly what we want. And then I'm just going to change that to DB because that's what my posts service expects. The other thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to pass in my posts service to my controller, because I would like my controller to be able to use the posts service. So let's save that, and then we'll go back to controller and we'll change this constructor function, posts service, and you would have seen this pattern before. Cool. All right, let's run that and see what happens. And we've got an error. Must be an instance of collab PDO null given. Now I think what's happening here is in our posts service. That'd be an error. I've got to fix that. I think because we're inside this namespace and we're just starting to use the class, I think what it's assuming that we want, what PHP is assuming that we want, is a class called PDO in the collab namespace. That might not fix it. I think we need a way of specifying the root namespace, and I'm not exactly sure how to do that at this point. Must be an instance of PDO in our posts service, and that's saying that we're getting null. Uncaught type error. Collab post service construct. So it's complaining that we're getting a null. Now that might be because this is not in the same scope, which is entirely possible. So let's solve that problem right now. Could be a scope issue. Aha, okay, great. So it was a scope issue, so we've solved that. Now we're getting a connection failed, could not find driver. Now, I have a feeling that we might need to set MySQL I, but that might not be it. So connection failed, could not find driver. Don't quite know why we're getting that. This is good. MySQL host. You need to have a PDO. Now I'm pretty sure we did have that. Interestingly, we might not. And we might actually need to recompile our version of PHP. Let's check. Post service, PDO. What I'm going to do for the moment is I'm going to remove the PDO dependency from here. Oh, this Vim issue is killing me. And we're going to comment that out. And we're going to remove this. So this should actually allow us to execute our app, which it does. Now on the about page, I've actually gone and set up my PHP info to render here. So we go PDO. You could also do this from the command line if you wanted to. Aha! And here is our problem. So the PDO, we haven't actually got any PDO drivers. So let's go back to the PDO documentation. And then we'll look at, we'll go back to the root. PHP.NET is an amazing resource, and the documentation can be a little bit sparse in places, but generally speaking, it's fairly complete. If we go install and configuring, we go installation. PDO is enabled by default. you may need to enable PDO driver for your database's choice. So this will be a PHP compile issue. So I'm going to go ahead and recompile my PHP because I believe that's what needs to happen. If you want details about how I'm going to do that, please comment in the section below and I'll post instructions on that. Otherwise, I will see you as soon as I get this issue sorted. Alright, so at this point, we have PHP recompiled, and if I just track back through my command history, this is the line that we used to recompile PHP. If you go through each switch, we've got without SQLite, without SQLite, without PDO SQLite. Excuse me, these are parameters I had before because I'm not interested in using SQLite. With OpenSSL, zlib, and MB string are all required by Composer, so that's why we've got those there. And then what I've just added is with PDO MySQL. So if we do a install bin php --info grep PDO. Let me just clear the screen and try that again. Yep. Okay, so here we've got API extensions PDO MySQL, and then the default socket location, which we're not using at this point, but we can use in the future. So given all of that, and we've got PDO, we can actually get back to using it. Now, while I was away figuring out the next steps for this, I realized a couple of things that we actually needed to do. The first thing was, let me just split my Vim view and I'll open up source context. The first thing I did was to create this additional context service, context class. Now, I've referred to this a couple of times throughout the series, but now was the time that I needed to pull the trigger because what I want to do is I want to get some tasks set up that I can run directly from the command line, things to populate the database. So what I've actually done here is I've created this separate context class, which is responsible for bringing up our entire dependency context. And then what I've done is I've separated out the constructor of that class and the application run method in two different methods. So this allows us to construct a context independently of actually running the context. And the other function that I've added is this get posts service. And why I've done that will come apparent in just a moment. So given that we've got this context class now, if we go to, I also fixed that really annoying Vim error. If we go to public index, you can see now that all we're doing here is we're running our context. Instantiating our context, and then we're calling start with the query parameter, which is exactly what this function here expects. The really nice thing about this pattern is that if I have a tasks folder, which I have just set up, and I have, say, a populate task here, I can require the context, set up a new context, and now I can interact directly with the context. So in this case, I'm interested in testing the insert from my posts service. I can actually call the posts service in the context directly. So this is really powerful because essentially what I can do is anytime I need access to the context, whether it be in a test, whether it be in a task, or if I'm actually executing the program via a web browser, all I need to do is require these 3 lines, and then Composer will go ahead and auto-load everything into for me according to the PHP specification, and I've essentially got access to my entire application. write in any file that I need. So what we can do at this point is we can say execute PHP, install PHP bin, install bin PHP, and then we can pass it our tasks, and then our populate task, and that will execute this get post service save right from the command line, which is really helpful because what I'm going to move on to now is building out our post service, but I'm not necessarily interested in getting it working from the web perspective. I just want to make sure all of my database is set up how I expect it to be. I just want to make sure my queries are working, etc., etc. So that's the advantage of doing that. Now, at this point, populate isn't doing anything because it calls get post service and then calls get save. But if I have a look at source posts service, my save function is actually empty. It's not gonna do anything. So you can see down here at the bottom, in the bottom Vim pane, we've got test123. That's the post body and user ID. So what we're going to do at this point is we're going to put together the query for this according to the PHP manual, and we are going to hopefully get to a point where we can execute the populate task from here and then see the changes update in our database. So let's go and do that. Okay, so new day, new ideas about UUIDs. It looks like building in UUIDs into MySQL isn't going to be as easy as I thought it was going to be. I prefer UUIDs for a whole number of reasons. If you'd like to know the reasons, let me know down in the comments section, and I can go into my reasoning for wanting to use UUIDs. But the pragmatist in me has won out, and I'm, for now, going to set my ID to a data type int, and then I'm going to use MySQL's auto increment feature. So for now, we'll have IDs that are integers. The reason that I've gone this direction and not the UUIDs like I originally wanted to is because it's a little bit more difficult than I anticipated to get UUIDs into MySQL. There was a few kind of funny things you had to do where you had to, the recommendation is to make the ID column a binary, and then you generate the UUID independent of the insert statement, and then at that point you would convert that UUID to a binary form, write it to the database, and then when you're selecting, you would then have to convert back from binary to UUID so that your application understands and can read the UUID as a string, which it ultimately would need to do. So all of that kind of got a little bit too hard. So I have abandoned those plans for now, and we're going to stick with ID int auto increment until we find a good solution. To let you know how keen I am on finding a solution for this, I've even gone ahead and created a Stack Overflow question here that basically details what I want. So I'm expecting a few answers on this. And yeah, maybe we'll be able to revisit this and figure out the best kind of approach. But for now, it's working, and I'll give you an update as to how my data services are working working with that new structure. So This is my posts service. We have a prepare statement here, which inserts posts into which inserts a post into the posts table. It's using body and user email. Actually, before I go, that's the other change I made. That's probably worth noting is I've abandoned using surrogate keys on tables that don't need surrogate keys. Initially, I was planning to use IDs and UUIDs everywhere across the application. My research into my MySQL UUIDs led me down the path of having to build triggers, which was at the time I was okay with. Because I hadn't played around too much with MySQL triggers, and I felt it was a nice chance to get my hands a bit dirty with those. It turned out that they as well didn't exactly work out how I wanted them to. So what I did is I ended up abandoning that altogether. But however, at the time I felt that if I was going to be using triggers, I probably didn't want to use surrogate keys on every table. So that's why I've changed the email address of users to be the primary key in this table. And I think I'm actually going to leave it that way. My opinion on using surrogate keys has changed over the years. Again, let me know if you draw me out on my opinions on that. They're not all that relevant for this video, but I'm always happy to engage in discussion about those kind of things. So yeah, here we have an email varchar45. So that will be the user's email address. So, and over here in the posts, the foreign key has the user email there. So that's kind of the evolution of that decision, which has led us to having a body here and a user email here. We're using the standard PHP variable substitution, and then I run this execute statement here that returns a boolean whether it was successful or not. Now, interestingly here, it's probably not all that relevant to return null, and in fact this is going to give us an error in PHP because the return type up here is in fact string. So what we'll eventually do here is we'll throw an exception, and then into that exception we'll pack in the messages that the error info functions return to us, and we'll raise that exception as par for course with this save method. And then the caller of this particular service at that point will need to be responsible for handling the exception, and we're gonna cover that in probably the next episode on the MySQL integration side of things. Given that we are relying on auto increment, which is the very common MySQL pattern, we can then use the last insert ID, and that returns as a string, and everybody is happy. So coming down to here, this is my task. In my task, I simply just create a new context. I generate a random number. What the number is at this point isn't significant, and then I create an email address with that random number. The reason being is that when I create a post, I need a user, and when I create a user, I need a unique email address. So this is just what I've done in my factory method for now to get around the uniqueness constraint on emails. I then grab the user service from the context. I then grab the posts service for the context, and currently now I iterate 10,000 times and save to my posts service. And if I run this task here, you can see it's going through and creating 10,000 posts. So this pattern will work for just about any service that will need to interact with MySQL. Currently we just have posts and users, but we will be extending this in a future episode. So if we sum up the work we've done, we have created our initial schema. we've defined a posts table, we've defined a users table, and we've also defined two services. We've defined our users service, which handles creating a user. We've defined our posts service, which handles creating a post. We've created a context, which I'll open up here. We've created a context which allows us to include our application anywhere we need it, and this will handle all of our context construction. It'll do all of our dependency injections and initializations for us. It'll also report an error if the database connection has failed. And we have also set up our tasks and the tasks runner, which has one task in it that takes advantage of that context with these 3 lines and then executes our services. This will lead us into being able to write tests that do similar things. If they want to interact with our database, they can. If not, we can send mocks in. That's all fine. And then this will allow us to start writing queries and building in queries that will allow us to populate our templates, which is what we're going to handle in the next episode. Thank you very much for your attention. I would really enjoy you guys leaving comments and giving me feedback, because really I want this series to be driven by that. And I will see you next time.